It's seed starting time. This is going to be a pretty quick overview. If there's any of these tips that you'd like elaborated on, feel free to reach out to me and I will expand further. But for the most part, this is going to be a fairly broad overview, so I'm not going to spend too much time with anything. So tip number one, before you do any planting, you'll want to assess your grow space. And there's a few things you want to keep in mind. How much space do you actually have? You want to make sure you have ample room for your plants to grow into. And if you don't have an idea of how large plants will become as they mature, a square foot gardening chart is a great way to get an idea of how much you can actually get away with in a particular amount of space. And you'll also want to consider how much light you actually get in those spaces. So observing your growing space throughout the day and ideally throughout the season in order to map out how much sunlight you actually get. Try to consider how the sun changes position throughout the year, and remember that just because there's a lot of sun in early spring, there may not be that much sun by the time summer rolls around. Visualize the plants fully grown and try to account for that as well. You don't want to have tall plants in a position where they're shading out all their neighbors, though you can use that to your advantage if you'd like certain plants to get some shade as the season goes on. Things like cilantro, basil, and lettuce can do really well in the filtered shade from like a cucumber or a tomato plant. And tip number two, be strategic with your planting dates. Determine the last frost date from your area and use that date to decide when you will actually sow what varieties. So if something needs 8 to 10 weeks to plant out, go to your last frost date and count back 8 to 10 weeks to determine what day you should actually be sowing. Tip number three, you know what you're planting, you know where you're planting it. Now you need to prepare your seed starting medium. Your seed starting mix doesn't need a lot of fertility in the early stages of seed germination, but you do want to ensure that it is loose, well draining, and free of any large chunks like wood chips. For my mix, I just use an organic, cheap, store-bought potting mix that I've sifted to remove all the large chunks, and then I'll add in vermiculite, perlite, and coco coir. And I keep a giant batch of this ready to go. When I'm sowing a ton of seeds, it's really handy to just have a giant tote full anytime I need it. So you'll want your seed starting mix to be moist but not wet. If you can grab a handful and squeeze it, you'll want only a few drops of moisture to come out, and ideally it will hold its shape really well. This is called field capacity and it's perfect for seed starting. And tip number four, make sure you're filling your seed cells the right way. It might seem silly, but there definitely is some strategy to filling your seed trays or tofu tubs or whatever. So what I do is I apply one layer really loosely to all the cells, make sure there's no big chunks, and level everything off. And then I'll just gently go in and press about halfway down. Not very hard. You're not trying to mash everything in, but you're just trying to create a solid little base that will hold moisture a little bit better. And then I go through again with just some little lighter dress on the top. Then I level everything out and it's ready to go. So tip number five is making sure you're actually planting enough in each cell. You don't want to just put one of everything in each cell, because then if you have germination issues, you've just wasted space. So it's wise to at least plant a couple seeds in each cell. And some varieties you can, if you're looking to maximize efficiency, you can get away with quite a bit more than that. Plants like kale, tomatoes, cucumbers, you can squeeze in quite a few more and divide them when it's time to transplant. But some plants are a little more fragile, so instead of dividing them, you'll just want to cull them when the time comes. So cutting them at the surface to ensure that you don't damage the root system by dividing will protect that more fragile seedling. Personally, I've never done this. And tip number 6 is to research your seeds and determine exactly what planting conditions they need. How deep should you sow them? Do they need light to germinate? Do they need cold stratification? Research for that particular variety because every plant is different. As far as cold stratification goes, I was very late to learn this, and for plants like perennials or natives, you're gonna wanna make sure that they receive a at least simulated winter condition in order for them to germinate. And this can be done either in the fridge or in a protected spot outside before it warms up. Determine if your seeds need light to germinate. So some plants can do either way, but if the plants absolutely need light to germinate, you're going to want to make sure they're not buried too deep beneath the surface of the soil. And do they need warmth to germinate? Peppers, tomatoes can do really well if they have a little extra heat provided. You can use seed mats, and this year I'm not actually using seed mats. I'm instead using the extra warmth provided by my grow lights. And tip number 7 is to manage your humidity. You'll want to put a cover on your seed starting trays to ensure that they stay moist enough for germination. Seed cells like this come with humidity domes, which are extremely handy, but if you're going the recycled growing container route, aka trash, you can find various clear plastic components that serve the same purpose. They're close enough. But make sure you don't leave the humidity dome on too long. Once the seedlings have emerged, you run the risk of damping off if they don't get adequate ventilation. So remove the dome and provide a fan to make sure that they stay dried out. And the fan will also help strengthen the stems of your plants by simulating a wind effect. And tip number 8 is adequate watering strategies. So if you do have a cell tray like this, bottom watering is amazing because you can just pour in to the tray itself and allow the cells to wick up moisture from the bottom, and you don't disturb the surface of the seeds at all. And you'll want to make sure you pour off any remaining moisture once they've had the chance to soak up their water. If you can't water from the bottom, a water sprayer is excellent because it is effective at saturating the soil, but also gentle enough that it is not pushing seeds into seed cells next to it. Tip number 9 cannot be overstated. Focus on adequate lighting. Do not skimp on the grow lights. Even if you have amazing natural light, it's not going to be enough to ensure that your seedlings have a healthy start. I absolutely do make use of the natural light from my windowsill, but I wait until the seedlings are a little more established, and even then it's not ideal. I use every bit of light available from my grow lights to ensure that my seedlings have the best start possible. And remember that not all grow lights are created equal. Those cheap blurples might seem okay in theory, but I promise you an investment in a proper grow light will absolutely pay off with happier seedlings. And tip number 10, once they've outgrown their cell trays, make sure you're potting them up. And you may have to do this multiple times. Do not allow them to get root bound or overcrowded in these tiny little cells. Try to catch them before they develop a huge root ball. If you can inspect the bottom drainage holes and you see little roots starting to form, now is a good time to transplant them to something larger. They'll have more room to develop a healthy root structure, but also you won't have to water them as much, so it's a win-win. And at that point, you can use a more robust potting mix. On that note, do not skimp on fertilizer. Once the plants are bigger, but before they're able to go outside, you'll want to make sure they're adequately fed. You're going to want to keep them happy the entire time, so when the time does come to put them outside, they have the best start possible. And some bonus tips. Try succession sowing. The first round of seed starting you do should absolutely not be your last. Plan ahead so that when you have things going into the garden, you're starting the next round in those same trays to take their place. So After my cabbage gets pulled out, I'm starting beans, I'm starting cucumbers, things that once I've harvested from that space in the garden, I immediately can plop in something else. And make sure you're hardening your seedlings off. You've worked so hard to get them to this point, but they've lived inside, so don't expect them to just be able to be thrust out into the world and acclimate in really intense conditions. Start slow, giving them an hour shade, warm exposure, and gradually increase that. They're still very fragile, but over the course of a few weeks, you can get them to the point where they can stay out indefinitely. And ideally, that will overlap with your final frost date. And on that note, do not plant everything all at once. Save some seedlings back just in case of a freak accident. You will have something to fall back on. Nothing worse than putting out everything you've started and a hailstorm or a hungry bunny completely wipes out your garden. You'll want to have a few on standby so that you can at least have a backup plan. Most importantly, have fun. Swap seedlings, share with your friends, try something new. Enjoy this period of new growth and put as much good energy into your baby garden as possible. Don't sweat it too much. Enjoy the process and learn from your experiences. I hope any of my experiences has helped you learn, and I wish you the best of luck with the season ahead. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you have any extra questions. Let me know if you have any other seed starting tips. Great to hear from other experienced individuals. And until next time, best of luck with your garden. I'll see you later. And for tip number 10. Oh, I have 2 tip number 10s.